Aztec slaves. Today we're going to learn about slaves in the Aztec society. The Aztec system of slavery was very interesting. Slaves were not captured people. Captured people were sacrificed to feed the hungry Aztec gods. Slaves were Aztecs. Okay, so in a lot of societies, when we've talked about slaves, they were captured people um, and they didn't have any rights. So they were not captured in the Aztec society. They were actually considered Aztecs. They weren't from a different civilization. So let's find out how you became a slave. There were only two ways you could become a slave. You could be made a slave as a punishment for a crime you had committed. Since most crimes were punished by death, this actually was a good alternative to most punishments. The other way was if your family sold you into slavery to pay family debts. Your period of slavery was over when your punishment was over. You could buy your way out of slavery once you paid off your debt. Okay, so in the Aztec society, there were two ways to become a slave. Number one, you did something wrong, and that was your punishment. Or number two, your family was in debt, which means that they owed money to someone for something. And so in order to not get in trouble for that, they said, okay, you can have my son, he will be your slave. So, but in the Aztec society, you could become not a slave again. So when you're either A, your punishment was over, or B, you paid your debt off, then you were free again. A slave's daily life was similar to the life of any free man. Slaves could marry other slaves. Slaves could even marry a free woman. Kids of slaves were not slaves. They were free citizens. They had not committed a crime and they had not been sold. Thus, they could not be slaves. But the noble's household had to support their slaves' kids and raise them as they would any kids. They could not put the kids to work because they were not slaves. Kids went to school. School was pretty much their life until they graduated. Having a slave could be very expensive. Okay, so in the Aztec society, if I was a slave and I had a kid, my kid did not automatically become a slave. That kid would live a regular life very much like you guys do today. He would go to school and that was his job, which is what your job is now, to go to school. So, but who took care of that kid? Who had to help raise him? The family that owned the slave. Plus, it was difficult to get rid of a slave once you bought one. If your slave refused to do your bidding, you had to drag that slave to a plaza and in front of witnesses prove that the slave refused to obey you. You had to do this on 3 separate occasions with 3 separate examples. Only then could you take your slave to slave market for a sale. A slave had to be sold 3 times in the slave market before a slave could be sacrificed. Okay, so to be sacrificed means basically to kill them. So you couldn't just be like, I'm done with this slave, I don't like him anymore. You had to actually prove that your slave was not doing your work or doing what you wanted him to do. And you had to do this in front of basically the town. You had to take him like to the town square and prove that the slave wasn't doing what you wanted him to do. And you had to do this 3 times in a row before you could sell your slave. Okay, and once the slave was sold 3 separate times, then a slave could be sacrificed or killed. There was another risk attached to having a slave. On the way to a plaza to prove a slave had disobeyed, slaves had the chance to run away. The only person who could chase them was the master's son. If the slave managed to get to the palace before the master's son caught them, they were free. If anyone interfered with the race, they became a slave themselves. All right, so you're a slave, you disobeyed your owner's taking you to the plaza to prove that you disobeyed him, but you decide to run away because you don't want to be a slave anymore. So the only person that can chase you is your owner's son, and no one else can help. And if he catches you, then you have to be a slave. And if he doesn't, you're free. I hope you can run really fast.